Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Arapides, here on behalf of the marketing team at School Health. I'd like to thank you for joining us today and participating in our Stop the Bleed by Preventing the Bleed webinar. Joining us today is FBI veteran, active shooter instructor, and founder of Threat Zero, Douglas S. Hart, and School Health's emergency preparedness specialist and former firefighter and paramedic, Vince Pesavento. Both of our speakers have dedicated many years to saving lives. We appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to be with us, and we would also like to thank everyone who has joined today as well. Before I turn the time over to Doug and Vince, I would like to review a few quick things about today's webinar. We will not be taking audio questions, but you can submit your questions via the Questions Interface tab in GoToWebinar. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and a link to it will be posted on the schoolhealth.com website. We will also email the link to all registrants for future playback. In that same email, everyone who attends the live presentation of today's webinar will also be receiving a certificate of attendance for joining us. This email will come from School Health, not GoToWebinar. If you are having technical difficulties with the audio or visual portion of today's webinar, please call GoToWebinar directly at 855-352-9003. The number once again is 855-352-9003. With that being said, let's turn the time over to Doug.
Thank you. For everybody who has signed in and is listening today, thank you for your time, and I hope that this will be valuable information for you. There's so much great content to talk about as it relates to school safety and violence prevention. As was said in the introduction, my name is Doug Hart. I'm the founder of Threat Zero Solutions, and I don't want to spend too much time on my background because there's so many important things to discuss during this brief time we have together. But I spent 27 years as an FBI agent, and most of my time was involved in the investigation of violent crime, and during the last several years of my career was dedicated towards preventing violent crimes from happening. In my position with the FBI, all of the potential threats in my area of responsibility would come directly to me on a daily basis. And I became so involved in what we call mitigating threats or preventing threats from coming to fruition that I undertook a lengthy course of study and became one of our nation's few certified threat managers. And so what's important to me in speaking to you today is to let you know that everything I'm going to tell you is 100% evidence-based, but is also heavily tied to my actual experience utilizing the evidence that we'll cover today in a proactive and positive way to actually prevent violence in our schools. This can be a heavy topic. That's certainly not my intent today. I believe that if we put the right training and tools in place, that this can be a positive, proactive message. I ultimately decided to leave a career I loved because I was so disturbed by the ongoing and increasing violence in our schools and the attacks that are happening. And as a trained law enforcement professional, I knew from my personal experience that targeted acts of violence in our schools could be prevented. And it became my mission to bring that knowledge to those who need it most in our nation's school, such as yourselves. So with that short introduction, let's jump in. This first slide is alarming, and I'm going to show some statistics to you that are going to be a little bit concerning, but I think that it's important because so much of what you hear as it relates to school violence is sometimes incorrect or blown out of proportion. And so I want to try to establish the scope of what we're doing in this field. This first slide has to do with 23 years of data regarding active shooter events in the United States. So this is inclusive of schools, but also the other sectors of society. And I only want to make one point with this slide, and that is the trend line that you see in red. And while these are still what we call low base rate events, the trend line is certainly alarming. And the numbers of these types of attacks that we're seeing in the United States is increasing at a rate that should concern all of us. So that's just where we're at overall, but let's look particularly at schools. And so this slide contains, almost 50 years of data. And this is a slide that shows the numbers of victims of violence on K through 12 school property. And really what I'd like you to notice here and highlight is if you look at 2018 through where we're at the present time, you'll see that in the past 5 or 6 years, we've had a really alarming increase in the number of victims of attacks on school properties. And so with the increase in the number of victims, there's a correlation that reflects the increase of the numbers of attacks. So let's pose the question, what best practices for school safety have been extensively researched by multiple federal agencies? This is an important question because we're 25 years past Columbine. And in that quarter century of time, a tremendous amount of really top quality research has been done by the FBI, the Secret Service, the Department of Education, Department of Homeland Security, and others. And that research has provided incredible data and evidence that we can use to make the appropriate decisions regarding school safety. So let's take a quick look at this. Now, I could talk all day about the evidence, and I frequently do just that in the many trainings that I conduct. As a certified threat manager, I've read all the research, but I want to highlight here in this one slide just a small number of crucial and universal findings, and that's an important word, universal findings, that multiple federal agencies have arrived at after each independently researching and studying school attacks. This is quite remarkable to me that over different periods of time, each of these agencies have conducted their own research, and essentially all of them have arrived at these conclusions that you see in this slide. So very briefly, the first solution is that specific behaviors precede school violence. And we're going to talk about that more. These behaviors are knowable. That's crucial. I could go through, time permitting, and tell you chronologically each of those behaviors. The identification and recognition and then subsequent sharing or reporting of those behaviors is absolutely crucial to violence prevention. There's a formula there that we need to pay attention to. School violence can be prevented when communities, and what we mean by communities is that the entire community in the school, meaning staff, teachers, coaches, bus drivers, cafeteria workers, students, parents, that's our school community. When that community is involved in identifying warning behaviors and intervening early. In other words, we don't want to let small problems become big problems. And the great news is we have the knowledge to do all of this. What has been deemed to be a best practice is what they call behavioral threat assessment and threat management. So if we know that violence is preceded by specific behaviors, and we identify those behaviors and get that information into the hands of those who are capable to assess that and choose the correct services to prevent violence from happening, we've struck gold. We're on the right path. And then lastly, and this is something that we see very lacking in a lot of places, is that school safety programs should be student-centered to be effective. So those are the universal findings that we've seen. Another one that I want to throw in there, this is another piece of the puzzle and one that should be of interest to all of us, as it has massive implications for the quality of life for our students outside of violence prevention. And this is a study that was done by the Department of Defense in response to an attack about 15 years ago. And what they found is that a critical component of violence prevention is tied to improving an individual's resilience, or in other words, improving an individual's capacity to deal with life's obstacles, to deal with the adversity that we all encounter. The issue is that some of us are able to deal with that adversity while others struggle and go to a really dark place. When we recognize this as a critical component as we were formulating Threat Zero solutions, we sought out the country's foremost expert in resilience and adversity, Dr. Paul Stoltz. He is a New York Times bestselling author and is an expert in this area. And as we presented to him the evidence we were looking at related to violence prevention and behavioral threat assessment, we asked him to add his research and studies regarding resilience and strengthening our ability to overcome adversity. And so we're very pleased to be partnered with him and to have his work reflected in what it is that we have created. So let's ask another question. Where is the focus on school safety today? This is one that I'm sure you have thought about many times before, and this deserves a little bit of our attention today. So, unfortunately, much of the discussion surrounding school safety today is centered on efforts to get more guns into the schools. There's a massive push for artificial intelligence and other highly advanced technological tools. And I won't really comment on those things other than to say that, in my opinion, we have to approach this holistically. So you see in the center of this slide, there's a small picture of a stool. And to me, that represents how we need to approach school safety. One leg of that stool is prevention, and that's what we're here to talk about today. Another is preparation. And so as Vince speaks to you about stopping the bleed and some of the marvelous tools that school health has in that regard, that's that preparation piece, having those things in place and ready in the event of a worst case circumstance. The third leg of the stool is response. And the reason it's important to talk a little bit about where the focus is on school safety today and to talk about response is that so much of the focus is on response and it's being mislabeled. We have a lot of well-intentioned people who are implementing solutions in the school safety space without a full understanding of the problem. And the result of that is you have misaligned measures, you have mislabeling of measures that are truly response measures versus preventative, and that in a worst case scenario, results in a false sense of security. So let's examine how this is true. And to do that, we ask the question of why should we focus on violence prevention through awareness and behavioral threat assessment? So let's jump back just for a minute about response. I got into this, I am still to this day an active shooter response instructor. I have been one for 15 years now. I'm a big believer in having the best response possible. I'm a huge advocate for being as prepared as possible. But so many of the solutions people are proposing involve getting people such as myself or law enforcement there faster. And a faster response, while it's desirable, is not the solution. And here's why. And here's why the evidence is so important. In a 10-year period, examining school attacks, the results of that study found that not one single school attack was resolved or ended by law enforcement responding from off campus. In fact, where SROs were physically present, so a person who is armed, who is a law enforcement officer physically present, only 15% of the time ended or resolved that attack. And why is that? Well, you have to look at that third statistic. It's because of how quickly these things start and finish. Almost 70% of the time, these school attacks, and this is from a 10-year period, lasted 2 minutes or less. And so these efforts that are focused on getting people there faster are not preventative. That is a response solution. And here is the key question that I would ask everybody listening to contemplate. Would you rather respond to a tragedy, however efficient and quick that response might be, or would you rather prevent a tragedy from happening in the first place? Any response, I would submit, is still a tragedy. Through our other efforts, we may be able to reduce the number of casualties. We should be able to prevent them from ever happening in the first place. Here's another key piece of evidence that I think may be surprising to you that goes along this theme. So these are the anatomies of a school attack. In other words, who's conducting the attacks and where. So this top bar is 10 years worth of data in our K through 12 schools. You'll see that about 3% of the time, these attacks are taking place in an elementary school environment. And in those cases, it's almost always what we call an outsider threat. Someone from outside of the school is coming to that elementary school to harm those children. Now, if we shift to middle school and high school, which comprises 95% of our school attacks, and then you look at the next bar, which shows who is committing those attacks, 90% of the time, those attacks are being committed by a currently enrolled student. We know who is committing the attacks, and we know where they're committing the attacks. And so in the middle school and high school realm, if you look at the statistics, it is almost exclusively what we call an insider threat, meaning that the person who is likely to carry out the attack is coming from inside of that school or organization. This evidence is being largely ignored in many school safety solutions and decisions that are currently being implemented. And so we need to pay attention to that. Let's jump to why behavioral threat assessment is a great tool for prevention. If we look at this slide, we see that 100% of these individuals, mainly students who committed these attacks, exhibited what we call pre-attack behaviors or concerning behaviors prior to their attacks. These are behaviors that are so prevalent that they should have elicited an immediate response. 94% of the time, they're displayed at school, and 92% of the time, they are observed by other students. So if you'll recall that universal findings slide where we said that student engagement in school safety is critical, this is what we're talking about. We know where the behaviors are being displayed and who's seeing them. Lastly, on this page, 91% of the time, those behaviors are being displayed a minimum of 3 months and much more often up to 2 years in advance of an attack. So we have quite a bit of time to see these behaviors and respond to them to prevent violence. And I just have to, I hope you're contemplating these statistics, because this is where we can really flourish. This is where we can exert proactive control over school violence, all based on documented evidence. This will work, but it requires a culture change of sorts. It requires us to change our mindset. But what I love about this is that it enhances and improves the well-being of our students and impacts them in a very positive way. So really quickly, as I kind of move towards the conclusion, let's look at the evolution of school violence, how this happens. Research indicates that those who commit attacks are under 3 to 4 pretty significant stressors in their lives. Just as you and I have stressors in our lives, it's that their stressors are such that they're unable to cope with them. In addition to the stressors, research has shown that attackers develop what we call a grievance. And the grievance is the cause of that person's distress or resentment. It's a perception of being treated unfairly. And that grievance is a slow boil. They can't get past it. And with that, they move into ideation, which means they've made a decision to act violently to address their grievance. Oftentimes in the school setting, we find that that grievance is directed at another classmate. The person then goes into what we call research and planning, preparation. Breach is simply a term to talk about testing the security at their intended target, and then culminates into the attack. The reason I show this process is because behaviors are displayed throughout time as a person moves along this pathway to violence. And this is where we can observe those behaviors and get that information to the right people who can then seek the appropriate services to off-ramp them from the pathway to violence. This works. I have personally done this. I've prevented school attacks by applying the measures and techniques that match the research. And I've also responded to school attacks where these tools and techniques were unapplied. So, how do we implement an all-inclusive solution? You know, the research is very helpful, but somehow schools need to turn the statistics and these findings into actions. And so the research indicates a need to deliver clear, consistent training, to implement a way for people to share concerns they see. They have to have a way to assess the threat those people pose, and then they have to establish some sort of team to affect that. And this can be a tall order. It's a tremendous burden, and there's a lack of continuity throughout our nation as it relates to this. Essentially, each of the school districts have been left on their own to figure that out, all while being bombarded by different opinions and theories and even some gimmicks. And that's why, as I said at the beginning, everything that we've done is 100% evidence-based. And using my nearly 30 years of experience in this field with the FBI, these are tested, tried and true techniques. This is just a quick slide to show what we've done at Threat Zero. And this isn't the format to get into any specifics about our company, but To solve the problems from the prior slide, the problem of implementing a researched or evidence-based solution, we founded Threat Zero Solutions. And it's comprised of those three elements that you see there on the screen. As I said during my introduction, I left the FBI because I felt compelled to use my experience and knowledge to focus directly on reversing the violent and tragic events that are plaguing our schools. Here's the reality, and I believe this with all my heart. With the right training and tools, violence can be prevented. We've seen that in the schools where we're working. We've seen the students get involved. We've seen wonderful sharing of information and concerns by the students, and we've been able to intercede and prevent tragedies from happening. Not only that, this same format works for the things that you face on a much more common basis, such as suicide and bullying and other things that are prevalent in our schools. We are so pleased to be partnered with School Health in this passion project, in this effort to have a positive impact on violence in our schools. I thank you so much for your time and attention, and hopefully we'll have some time to field a few questions. And with that, Vince will now talk about some really vital preparation pieces that should be in place in our schools, and I will turn the time over to him.
There we go. Doug, thank you very much. That was a very informative presentation. Really appreciate it. Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I would like to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to join both Doug and I for this presentation today. I'm going to briefly talk to you about Stop the Bleed, some basic first aid kits, some of the differences, and I'm going to give you a couple little bit demonstrations as we go along on some of the bleeding control devices that we have. My name is Vince Pesavento. I'm the emergency preparedness specialist here at School Health. I came to School Health with 25 years of service as a firefighter paramedic. I am still currently licensed as a paramedic in the state of Illinois. Besides that, I am an adjunct instructor at a junior college just outside of Chicago. I've been doing that for 15 years now, teaching emergency medical technician courses. Within the last 5 years, I was promoted to the coordinator of the emergency medical technician program and emergency program services. I also oversee the emergency response at my college, along with a new team of people. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Stop the Bleed. What is Stop the Bleed? The Stop the Bleed is a national campaign aimed at teaching bystanders how to respond effectively in emergency situations involving severe bleeding. You may ask, why was it launched, or when did this all come about? Well, the initiative was launched after the Sandy Hook Elementary School shooting in 2012. The reason it was launched was to recognize the immediate action to save lives in situations where victims may be experiencing uncontrolled bleeding. What does the campaign provide? Well, what the campaign is going to provide is training to teach you different bleeding control techniques, such as applying a pressure dressing, packing wounds, and/or applying a tourniquet to a limb. Stop the Bleed aims to provide survival rates in emergencies before professional help can arrive. Many of you may have some questions out there, and when you're looking for different things, what is the difference between what we call a first aid kit or a trauma kit? A lot of us have known trauma kits as more of a Stop the Bleed kit. First aid kits are intended to deal with very minor injuries, from everyday minor cuts to some small lacerations to burns, sprains, strains, and also possibly stings from bees, wasps, and other creatures that are out there. As where we have a trauma kit are ideally to deal are ideally designed to deal with life-threatening conditions where someone may have major bleeding and where we need to stop that major bleeding before that professional help does arrive. First aid kits can be found almost anywhere, in your workspace, at your school, in your home, at a grocery store. Inside those first aid kits, we have a lot of basic stuff. One of those being those adhesive bandages, or commonly known as, a lot of people know them as Band-Aids. Inside first aid kits, you may find roller gauze or 4x4 or 2x2 or 4" 2x2" gauze pads that you could apply to someone's body part if they are bleeding. You may find antibacterial ointment in it, sting relief wipes. Some cases, first aid kits might even have some acetaminophen in it. Instant cold packs are very common in the first aid kits because it's hard to find a cold pack. Alcohol preps and nitrile or some type of BSI, body substance isolation barrier, so that helps prevent bloodborne pathogens from being transmitted. The major differences in between that first aid kit I just described and those trauma kits, inside those trauma kits, you're going to find different style of products that are dealing with more of a massive type of bleeding. One of those products being a tourniquet, which I will get to a little bit later in this presentation and give you more of a definition on the tourniquet. And I'm also going to show you how to apply a tourniquet to a limb. There's alcohol prep pads in them. You can have burn dressings. You can have different types of sterile gauze in there. We have compression gauze, quick clot gauze. You may have something called an Israel bandage in there, which is a bandage that is more of a pressure dressing bandage to apply to a limb to help stop bleeding. In some more of the advanced style kits, we have something called a chest seal or a hyphen seal. So if somebody has a wound to a chest, we can apply that. There's different types of scissors. So your first aid kit has a basic scissor. Inside the trauma kits, you're going to find something more called a trauma shears. Trauma shears are very sturdy, thick, and heavy type of shears, and they're meant to cut through clothing and heavier products than your normal scissors would. Inside your trauma kits, you also have some type of bloodborne pathogen resistant gloves in there. Usually we call them nitrile gloves. Some of the kits, and again, the more advanced ones, will have an emergency blanket in there where you can cover someone to help conserve heat, body, and keep their body temperature. Inside any of the trauma kits out there, they have some type of an instruction card. The instruction card will give a brief overview of what to do in an emergency and tell you how to possibly apply a tourniquet and or a pressure dressing. And then lastly, permanent markers. Inside the trauma kits are permanent markers. And I'll get to that, and you may be wondering why, but I'll get to that when we come up to tourniquets and explain why we have permanent markers inside there. So a couple little things that I wanted to hit on in the trauma kits are going to be your bleeding control dressings. These bleeding control dressings are to help accelerate the natural clotting factor that you have inside of you when applied. They help prevent clots up to 5 times faster, and it can control bleeding within minutes. A couple of common names of these bleeding control dressings are quick clots, which you might have seen. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to pause the video and I'm going to show you a quick demonstration on how to pack a wound using a quick clot for a dressing. First thing, I'm going to put on my appropriate PPE here. Now let's assume that my patient has a wound in their thigh and they were shot with a gun. They have a hole inside here that's continuously bleeding. It's a deep hole, as you can see. And I'm gonna need to pack that because the first thing I'm gonna wanna do when I get there is try and do a pressure dressing, and it's just not gonna stop bleeding. So we're gonna grab our quick clot. Quick clot is packaged in several different ways. If you saw in the previous slide, it comes in a folded package when we're gonna pack a wound like this. So we're gonna open up this quick clot, and it's in a square and it unfolds like this. And it stays pretty together. You just gotta be careful. You don't wanna drop it because it will unfold. There are newer styles of quick clot out there now that will not unfold. They'll stay together as you pull it. So my wound is right here. I'm gonna take my 2 fingers and open up my wound. And as I'm going to do that, I'm going to pack my wound with this quick clot material. Now, based on the size of the wound, how deep and how big will matter how much quick clot. You're going to really want to take and pack this wound as full as you can. As it starts getting packed, I'm going to open up the wound on the other side so I can continue packing this wound. And once I'm done and I have the wound packed as tight as I can, I will then go and get my roller gauze, and you can use your trauma shears to cut off the extra end of it, and I'll take and I will put a pressure dressing over that wound. This will help control bleeding. Not all the time bleeding will not stop all the time when you utilize this. What may happen is you might see blood start coming through. You're going to want to add an additional dressing to this and keep adding and adding. If this is an arm or a leg, what we're going to talk about next, I'm going to jump back into the PowerPoint, is a tourniquet. What is a tourniquet? A tourniquet is a device or a strip of cloth, a band or rubber that is wrapped tightly around a limb. You cannot put it on the torso, it's for use for a limb, to prevent the blood from continuously flowing. So when you put it on, we're cutting complete circulation off so we can control that bleeding. There are tons of different tourniquets on the market. Sorry about that. Tons of different tourniquets on the market. We don't endorse any specific one. Here's a couple different ones on this slide here. The SWAT T tourniquet is more of a rubber-based type of tourniquet, like a tight rubber band going around. The CAT tourniquet is just below that. I'm going to show you the CAT tourniquet in a minute and go into some more details. Then you have your SAM XT tourniquets, your soft T tourniquets, and a rapid application tourniquet. This is, again, a personal preference of what people want, but there is also state legislation that some certain states are requiring certain tourniquets in the trauma kits and or stop the bleed kits that are out there. Tourniquets are broken down into several different pieces. You have a buckle, you have a windlass rod, you have a band, and then you have a locking adhesive thing. Strip over it. If you notice in this picture, there's a band that is marked time. If we remember, I just talked to you a little bit about that permanent marker. This is what the permanent marker is for. When you apply a tourniquet to a patient, once it's tightened and locked into place, you want to write the time that the tourniquet was placed, the time down the tourniquet was placed on the patient. This will help the emergency room and doctors determine how long the tourniquet has been on, what type of cellular damage may be happening distal or farther away from that tourniquet, because we're cutting off all circulation to that area, and they're going to make their determination how they're going to remove it in the hospital. When you apply a tourniquet to a patient, you never want to remove it. You want to leave it in place, and the emergency physician and or a hospital will remove that tourniquet. What I'd like to do now is I'm going to pause this and I'm going to show you how to apply a CAT tourniquet. All right, here is a CAT tourniquet. They come in usually a couple different colors. You have them in orange and black. If you see one in blue, the blue ones are technically more of a training type of tourniquet. It is a Velcro. That is a very tight Velcro. You have your functioning buckle up here, your windlass rod, which is here. You have your band, and it is adjustable band. You can make this tourniquet, can fit over a leg. If you have someone who has rather large thighs, you can also take and double these tourniquets up, or you can make the tourniquet go as small as an arm, about that size. I'm going to apply this tourniquet to myself today because this tourniquet has the ability to apply it to yourself if needed. I'm going to make sure I take my time. I'm going to Velcro here because I'll show you the importance of that in a minute. So I'm going to put the tourniquet on my arm because it goes on an extremity, and I'm going to hold it down and I'm going to pull it as tight as I can, and I'm going to come around with the Velcro here. What you want to do is when you come with the Velcro, this piece right here is meant to hold the windlass stick. But another advantage of it is, so the tourniquet does not come off the arm, is you tuck your Velcro under so you can't pull that Velcro back through. Now, yes, this tourniquet is a little bit loose on me. I'm not putting it extremely tight because I don't want to cut off my circulation. And then you'll take the rod and you will twist it around the arm, and once it's tight, and the blood stops flowing is you will tuck it underneath the latch right here. This holds it in place and keeps it tight. When you're applying a tourniquet to a patient, you're going to want to first pull that tight and then take that rod and turn it until the bleeding stops. This is going to create an amount of pain for the patient. They are going to feel it, and you're going to turn it as tight as you can until the bleeding completely stops. Once you do that, you hook it here, you take this piece, you come back over, and you take your marker and you write down the time. Now, questions have been presented to me in the past about what if during this process the tourniquet is not working anymore and they're continuing bleeding. Well, you will undo the time, you will come back here, and you'll take your windlass rod out, and then you'll start turning it even tighter. You're going to make it tighter to stop the bleeding. And then you're just going to re-cinch it back down. Here, let's jump back into the presentation. One last thing that I'd like to discuss to you, besides everything else about Stop the Bleeding, we're going to talk to you a little bit about emergency planning. In emergency planning, make sure you have a plan in place, especially when it comes to severe weather. Tornadoes are a big thing this time of year. Make sure you practice and have your tornado drills ready. When we talk about fire, not only are we going to be talking about evacuation drills for fire alarms or a possible fire inside of a building, we're also going to have an emergency plan in place on how to utilize that fire extinguisher. When you have a possible fire or a fire in a building and you attempt to put it out using a fire extinguisher, and you use one fire extinguisher and the fire is not getting smaller, it's getting bigger, putting 2 or 3 more fire extinguishers on that fire will not put out the fire. It's time to exit that building immediately. Active shooters and or intruders is another type of emergency planning. Know your lockdown procedures and what you're going to do. Practice them, go through the drills with them. We're also going to talk a little bit about injuries. Injuries could mean just somebody who has been injured previously and or during any one of the emergencies I just discussed. You may have somebody who is on a second floor of a building and or a below grade, meaning like a basement of a building, and they may have suffered an injury outside of that, a broken leg. A fire alarm comes in or a fire, the elevators immediately go to the first floor during a fire, and what you need to do is evacuate that person from a second floor. Consider having an emergency chair or an evacuation chair in your area of refuge, meaning the stairwells, so you can take that person down the stairs. Not only might you need that emergency evacuation chair in that area of refuge during a fire, but if there is an active shooter situation and you have someone who has some form of disability and can't get down the stairs, you may need to evacuate them down the stairs. There are a lot more emergencies that we can talk about, sheltering in place, lockdowns and everything else, but I wanted to keep it brief and simple today and also be respectful of your time and allow you to, at the end of this presentation, have questions where Doug and I can answer for you. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to this. I really appreciate it. And should you have any questions, please let us know.
Thank you, Vince. That was very informative, and thank you, Doug, as well. We do have questions from people asking some emergency-related topics, and we'd like to go through those with you right now. Our first question we have actually comes from many people that have been wondering this. We have, what is the correct amount of tourniquets or bleeding kits, etc., like supplies, per the amount of people in a school? Is there a set number that either of you can speak on to, like, is it like per 30 kids, you want to have this many supplies? Just in general, you can get into specifics with this if you need to. I'm not sure exactly if there's a straight answer for this.
Doug, I'll let you go first on this one.
Yeah, that's a great question. And what we've done in our county, we've made an effort to put these mass casualty kits in every school. But what we did is we looked at the blueprints of each facility. And so we would examine the blueprints of a school and we would determine the number of kits based on the physical layout. And so Each kit, or at least in my experience, the largest kit contains 8 separate trauma kits. And so if we had 2 wings of the school and a gymnasium and a cafeteria and a theater, again, going back to my comment on the duration of these things, they're generally localized to 1 or 2 areas of the school. And so I believe the best philosophy is to place these kits in alarmed cabinets where they can be accessed by anybody at strategic locations based on where the students are throughout the school. So that includes the hallways for classrooms, cafeterias, gymnasiums, theaters, and just look at your physical facility and then determine the number of kits. We found that in the larger schools, we might put as many as 7 or 8 kits, but it's all based on looking at the blueprints.
And what Doug just said, absolutely correct. Looking at the blueprints, there's been some state legislation out there and some counties legislation that are requiring the minimum of 1 kit in every classroom, because if there is a lockdown situation, those people aren't going to be exiting the classrooms to go get an emergency bleeding kit. So the state legislators have looked and have pushed to put 1 kit in every room. As Doug said, you want to strategically place them throughout the buildings. What we've been seeing a lot is these kits are being placed into AED cabinets along with the defibrillator, and the signage on the walls is now saying AED and stop the bleed kit or bleeding control kits. It's not a recommendation to take all these kits and put them in your nurse's office in one location at the school.
Thank you for that answer. You actually answered a follow-up question to that about like where to place them. So thank you for being so thorough on that. We have a question from Jacqueline, and she is asking, how do you deal with a child that is scared in a bleeding situation?
Jacqueline, that can be a very traumatic situation. I've unfortunately, in my line of work, have had to deal with many children in bleeding situations, and some of them extremely severe bleeding situations. The best thing to do is to speak to them calmly, and what I try and do is find something that I can relate to that child with, something special they made, like a special TV show or a friend, or they did something special. They're on a baseball team, and I try and keep them distracted from the injury while treating the injury and get their mind off of it.
Thank you, Vince. That was very thorough. Our next question comes from Denise. We have a couple questions about school nurses, and this question comes from Denise asking, when is it safe to pull a school nurse out of an emergency, and what type of role would law enforcement expect the school nurse to play in a situation where there is a crisis?
Doug, I'll let you handle that on law enforcement end.
Yeah, one of the things that you see today in an effort to improve law enforcement response to these tragedies is that we're cross-training quite a bit with folks such as Vince, who are the paramedics. But just so you know, there's a priority. So if you're involved in a violent attack, when law enforcement arrives, their first job is to stop the killing. And then the second job is to stop the dying. And so until that first one is done, law enforcement isn't going to start attending to the casualties. They have to eliminate that threat first. Once the threat is eliminated, then I think if you feel able, any help that can be rendered to stop the bleeding, that's where most of the loss of life occurs because of the time it takes for first responders to get there. That's of benefit to you, but certainly you wouldn't be expected to put yourself in harm's way until that threat's been eliminated from a law enforcement perspective.
And to kind of piggyback off of what Doug was saying, I've been involved in a lot of the trainings. I've never been in an active shooter situation. I was one of the lead EMS trainers. I've developed several programs for active shooter training for the village I work for. What we would do is, like Doug said, the first entry team would be to stop. Then when there enough police arrived in our situations, we would have an entry team of EMS, and we were guarded by police. We'd have one in the front, one in the back, one on the side, and we would go in and we would do a system called a triage of patients. We would start assessing and treating the patients from the most severe to the walking wounded and getting them out of that situation and moving them into a treatment area. The question that the nurse had is, when they feel it is safe and they can treat, they're going to treat and do the best they can for the most people. It's going to be a very taxing situation and a lot of stress on that school nurse, but just do as much as you can, and hopefully some of your staff, and when they feel it is safe, will also be able to help with controlling bleeding and getting other patients out of that area from the hot zone into a warm or cold zone.
And a piggyback question off of this, which Vince, I think you're touching on this right now, actually, at the end of that, comes from Sarah, who's asking, what is a school nurse's role in a crisis and how can they best support first responders?
First, most the school nurse in a crisis, they need to protect themselves. And once the situation has been mitigated and it's safe for that, the school nurse would just be most likely assigned by a fire department personnel or an EMS personnel to help where is needed and be directed. Because it's going to be a lot of chaos, unfortunately, right away. And we'll take the help wherever is needed.
Thank you for that. Our next question comes from Alex, who's asking, who should be the first person you contact if you think someone would be a threat at a school?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish there was a single right answer. Some schools have, and I believe all schools should have, a formal reporting tool to share concerns that they see. In my experience, some places have them and they're well used. Other places have nothing. So in the event that you have a formal reporting mechanism available to you, I would encourage the use of that. If you don't, then it's my recommendation that you go directly to one of the school administrators and make sure that there's a positive handoff of that information so that nothing slips through the cracks. And that's the tragedy we see from time to time, is in the after action reports when we look at these things, that people had information and they failed to share the information. And so that's that culture change we're talking about of getting everyone in that school community in the mindset of sharing, which is an act of concern, it's an act of compassion, and getting that information into the hands of people who can take action. The SRO is another great person to report to if you have an SRO in your school.
Thank you for that, Doug. Appreciate it. Our next question we do have a few minutes left in the webinar, so keep that in mind, just calling it out right now. Our next question is also being asked a lot. It's a multi-part question where the first part is, how many staff members in a school should receive training to stop a bleed, or receive training in the event of a crisis to assist in some way?
In my opinion, all of them. I don't think there's direct, sorry, go ahead, Doug.
Well, I agree, Vince. So one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that 92% of these kinds of attacks occur in rural and suburban areas. And so these are areas where the time, the national average response time for law enforcement is roughly 3 minutes, but in these more rural areas, that could be several minutes. And Vince can tell you far better than I, what kind of timeframes you're dealing with in terms of potential loss of life from bleeding. But every law enforcement officer carries these tourniquets. We're all trained. They're not difficult to use. They're a remarkable life-saving tool. And so the more people that are trained and capable of using these tools, the greater the opportunity to have those injuries be survivable because the bleeding was controlled early on.
I agree. The tourniquets, again, are all the law enforcement that I've worked with, being on the fire side of it, they all had and carried tourniquets, and that's in those stop the bleed kits that are there. So training as many people as possible is going to help, because you're going to need those adults there who can help treat those students and or keep them calm.
Thank you for those very thorough answers. Piggybacking again off of that, another question, I think this is more for Vince. We've been getting questions about who should be replacing like bleed kits or the supplies, or who should be in charge of that? How should these kits be monitored, where if they do need to be needed, we make sure that they're not expired, they're working properly, and they're properly supplied and stocked?
That is a real good question. Usually what we recommend is, if the school has a school nurse, and I understand some schools nurses bounce around from district to district to different schools, the school nurse should keep some type of log of the kits, because most kits have somewhere in the range of 2 to a 4-year expiration on some of the products that are inside stop the bleed kits. If it's not a school nurse, it can be a school administrator, like an assistant principal or a principal, that has a chart of this, because it's going to be very important that they know when they expire, when they need to reorder the kits, just kind of like you would on a normal medicine bottle.
Thank you for that. I think we have time for one more question. And this question comes from Nicole, and she is asking, can mass trauma supplies be used beyond their expiration date? I know it's not, of course, it's not ideal if they're expired, but if they were, is it better than nothing?
Based on that question, I have to go off with what the manufacturer says on this. When they're expired, you need to swap them out and keep them. Is there a possibility you could use them? Probably, but what happens is, when they expire, certain things lose, like clotting factors and other parts of it, that they're not going to work. So keeping up on the expiration dates is extremely important, and swapping them out in a timely manner.
So follow what the manufacturer says, and just be on top of it, because it could be the difference between life and death, correct?
Yes.
Thank you for that. I think that's all the time we are going to have for today. So thank you for attending today's webinar. We hope you're able to take a lot out of the presentation and found the information useful. Thank you again to Doug and Vince for sharing all this important information with us. After you exit the webinar, you'll see a survey window, and please note that the survey will not appear on the recording. We would ask each of you to please take a moment for this brief survey and help us improve what we've done here today. That will end today's broadcast. Thank you for joining us.